Hello, and welcome to another episode of LGOtv Big Talk. And why Big Talk? Because I hate small talk. Now, my guest today is a dear friend of mine who also doesn't really like to make small talk, mostly because the things she talks about are really big things. Dr. Tina Opie is a keynote and interactive workshop leader. She focuses on creating a more diverse, inclusive, and equitable workplace. Now, she is a tenured professor at Babson. She is a visiting scholar at Harvard. She has been hired to speak and consult with organizations like American Express, Hulu, the NFL, and so many more. She uses this approach called the Shared Sisterhood Framework, which helps us to unearth some of our blind spots within individuals and in our organizations. And she serves in this way as a catalyst for new thinking and so much needed change. I'm so excited to dig into Shared Sisterhood. I'm so excited to talk to you. Tina, welcome to Big Talk.
Thank you so much, Laura. I need you to be with me everywhere to introduce me. I feel sort of important.
You are sort of important. And your topic is sort of important. I mean, it's kind of at the root of everything right now. But before we get to shared sisterhood and before we get to how we individually and collectively work to tear down, racial and social injustice in the world, I want to talk about not Dr. Tina, but I want to talk about baby Tina. I want to talk about who you were when you were growing up, because so much of what I like to talk about, as you know, is this sort of moment of wonder hell, this moment of,
Yeah.
oh my God, I can do this thing. It's actually working. There's actually a bigger thing that I need to be doing that I didn't even realize I could do until I did this one thing. Oh no, now what do I do? And so somewhere along the way, baby Tina saw the world in a certain way and then saw the world in a different way. And because she saw the world in a different way, became Dr. Tina, which became the beginning of Shared Sisterhood. So I want to talk about who you were in the beginning and how that all went down. I read, you were kind enough to give me an early draft of the Shared Sisterhood manuscript. I read through it, and there's a great story that you tell about waking up one day and realizing that, oh, you're Black and you're a woman, but you have to choose one of those first. So let's
Yeah.
talk a little bit about that moment when young Tina figured out that the world was maybe a little different than she thought it was.
Right. And Laura, thank you for that. So there are several things. Actually, before so there's a moment when you said, tell me about baby Tina. And it's not in the book. It's a time so I've always been really curious to the point where I got in a lot of trouble. And there was one particular time, I don't know if you remember, well, I guess they still have pilot lights on the stoves
Yes.
with the gas. So I didn't understand how it worked. So if you can imagine me with my long hair, like bangs, afro hair, bending over into the pilot light, I burned my bangs. And I had to cut them off, and the smell of singeing hair and I thought I was going to get in trouble. My mother never said anything, but this is going to sound crazy. I literally used to take appliances apart. I went to school in California, and for some absurd reason, they had a table full of appliances, old like microwaves, toasters. I would take those things apart and put them back together and try to see how they worked. And then that sort of fast forwards to the moment you're talking about, I think, where I didn't understand why. If you're talking about the story where I was in graduate school, I went to the Darden School of Business, and I didn't understand why, if it's supposed to work this way, meaning if we're all supposed to be feminists, why do I feel like I have to choose between being Black or being a woman? That both of those, the intersection of those two, is not appreciated. Specifically, when I was in the women's group, I think it was called GWIB, and those are some really dear friends. But I remember when I went to the meeting, I felt like we were talking about issues of women, and one of the issues at Darden was that there was one Black woman faculty.
Okay, so let's back this up for
Yeah.
people who are not sitting in the meeting with you. So you're in graduate school and you're looking around and you're like, there are not a lot of people who look like me as faculty. And here's this group, this women's group that wants to talk about inequity in representation in faculty. So you go to the meeting and they're talking about women, but you're like, wait a minute, it's women, but what about the fact that there's no Black women?
Yes, there's no Black women, and I felt sort of muted. Like I needed to not be difficult or not add that. We need to just focus on gender. Let's just look at being women. Let's not try to then make it more difficult. Let's just try to get more women faculty. And I remember I I didn't go back often. I ended
Yeah.
up going to the Black Student Union at Darden because I felt like I could be more of my authentic self. And what's interesting is my experience is mirrored in a lot of the experiences that my clients have,
Hmm.
where I'd ask your leaders to look at their ERG composition or their affinity group composition. Oftentimes, the women's groups are primarily populated by white women. If you want to see women from historically marginalized categories, the Black women are often in the Black affinity group, the Asian women are often in the Asian affinity group, Hispanic or Latinx women are in that group, and then white women tend to be in the women's group. It's important to investigate that.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I grew up. I think I told you in a high school. We're
Mhm.
friends. So we've had this conversation. And my high school was one third Black, one third Latino, one third white. We had a smattering of Asians, but not a huge population in
Mhm.
Miami in the '80s growing up. And the Black people were Haitian, they were Dominican, they were
Yeah.
African American. The Latinos were Venezuelan, they were Puerto Rican, they were Cuban, they were pre-marital, post-marital. The white kids, there were rich kids, there were poor kids. It was you had every religion you can imagine, and I just grew up thinking I was white because
Mhm.
I wasn't Black or Latino or
Yeah.
Asian. And then I got to college in Texas, and
Mhm.
suddenly I experienced anti-Semitism for the first time in my
Mhm.
life, and I was like, oh, I'm not white, I'm Jewish.
Mhm.
Interesting. Like in other people's mind, I was Jewish before I was white. And that was the first time I had had the experience of my identity is multifaceted, right? I'm white, I'm Jewish, I'm a woman, I'm like whatever the things are. And so I think that this is such an and then I pledged a Jewish sorority because I was Jewish first, right?
Oh, wow.
And white second. And so because that's what the environment there was. I remember walking in sorority rush to a non-Jewish house and saying, "Wow, I really like it here." And the sorority girl was like, "Yeah, we like you too. It's just too bad." And I was like, "What's too bad?" And she's like, "Well, you'll be pledging one of those Jewish houses, right?" And I was like, "Really?
Wow.
Why? Why would I like I had no concept of it." So this idea of if you look at these resource groups, these ERGs and the affinity groups at companies, and you look for the women of color, you find them with the people of color, not with the women, is a fascinating distinction that I think, draws back to the very beginning of the feminist movement that
Oh,
you
yeah.
talk about in your book. And so you talk about the story, and I will talk more about the this who belongs to what club in a minute, but I want to ground it in this story of early feminism because for me that was something that I came to learn about 10 years ago, and I was
Yeah.
sort of shocked and a kind of embarrassed, to be honest, that I and felt stupid that I didn't know it. So feminism, you talk about how in your book that for a long time you didn't call yourself a feminist.
Mhm.
So let's talk a little bit about why that was.
That's a great question, Laura. And it connects to the conversation we were having about feeling like I had to choose between two identities, being
Hmm.
Black or being a woman. And when I would interact with people who were calling themselves feminists, they were often white women, and they were women who, in my perception, did not want to talk about racism or racial
Hmm.
equity. And so I felt as though a huge part of my identity was being ignored. And sort of, I was expected to conform to their notion of what a feminist was. And so I rejected it. Alice Walker, others have used the term womanist, and that has to do with being more inclusive of and valuing all women. And so I would sometimes call myself that.
Wait, can we before you keep going? So can we talk about why the term feminist versus womanist?
Well, it's honestly because I associated feminists with white women and being excluded as a Black woman, and
Okay.
womanist as being a more inclusive term. I didn't really use that term. I was pretty ignorant myself. I had to do some reading of people like Alice Walker and Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde and other the Combahee River Collective. If your audience don't is not familiar with that, if you look it up, the conversation about feminism and womanism is directly addressed with this group.
Okay.
But so I just felt like I had to choose, Laura. And whether or not we like it, in this country, Black people are identified as Black. We can get into the one drop rule. We don't necessarily have to. But I think you experienced it when you said you went to college. that wasn't necessarily you choosing to do the Jewish sorority. It was what was ascribed to you. And I think that's a really important thing. You're muted.
Sorry, I grew up Jewish. Like, I never went to synagogue. I didn't have a bat mitzvah. I didn't have any Jewish friends. I was dating non-Jewish boys. I was the least identified in my own mind as Jewish as possible. So yeah, it was everyone else assigning that, which, whatever, passing privilege, right? Like, I don't walk around with that on my skin. Like,
Yeah.
it's a completely, I recognize it as a completely apples to oranges conversation, but just sort of coming, and we'll get into this, and sort of shared sisterhood, like finding like digging and finding some of the similarities and understanding, so we can also identify where we're dissimilar,
Yes.
and create understanding. So that's I'm just so fascinated with this difference between feminism and womanism, and this idea that feminism is like, it's rooted in what we considered feminine at the time, right?
Yeah,
As opposed to, like,
exactly.
being our full version of ourselves,
Exactly.
which wasn't allowed for you.
Well, so I could feel the pressure to not do it, but you know me well enough to know that I am definitely rebellious. In some ways, it's weird that I ever even became a Christian because I am rebellious. So, it's like, but it's interesting. This is crazy. I'm rebellious, but I respect authority. I'm the oldest child, so I sort of did what my parents wanted to.
Yeah.
And my mom, whatever. I'm probably telling too much private information, Laura. But my dad was abroad when he was in the military. So when I was first born, it was just my mom and I. And that relationship, I never wanted to disappoint her. So I always obeyed, but I'm very rebellious. And so I could feel people trying to tell me, this is the way that a Black woman needs to behave. This is the way a woman needs to behave. I'm like, I reject that. I am my own person. Yes, I listen to Blondie and Pat Benatar and Fred Hammond and Kirk Franklin, etc. You know what I'm saying? I love gospel music. I love rap. I like some Kiss. I mean, how dare you tell me what I'm supposed to listen to and like and read?
Yes. So that's interesting. So growing up, I mean, you're an Army brat. There's a lot of rules in the military.
Navy and Marine. My parents would kill me if I.
Sorry, Navy and Marine. I'm sorry, Navy and Marine. Army, right? So you're a military brat, I should say that. Navy and Marine. Apologies to everybody in the service. We respect everyone equally here.
No, of course.
But so you have that. The religion has a lot of rules also, and yet in that you're finding your own way. And also, for those who are listening, who if you cannot see Tina, I need to paint just a small mental image that Tina is not somebody who disappears easily. She is not somebody who can hide. She is a large woman. You are tall. You take up space. You wear big earrings and signature jewelry, and you wear bright colored shirts. Like you do not, right? You do bright red lipstick. Like you do not fade away into the background. So even if you wanted to hide and be a rule follower, it'd be difficult for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think at a certain age, so one of the things that's really cool is I have never thought that I was unattractive or unintelligent.
Yes.
My parents raised me, and I've never felt like I needed to be quiet or that my ideas weren't as good. So I've always spoken up.
And you were raised with a lot of Black excellence in the house. You talk about that in the book. It was so touching.
Yeah. I mean, I was surrounded. One of the things that I talk about in the book is how what I learned about being Black at a very young age. And the good thing is, that specific moment was when I got into the pool when I was little, and all the white kids got out.
When you were 7.
My skin was going to somehow dirty up the water. But fortunately, before then, I was surrounded by Black art. Even if you look at my home office now, it is clearly it's global, but there are Afrocentric things. I love Black art. I love Black people. I love being Black. And that doesn't mean that I hate white people, which is something that has been misinterpreted, I think, by many times. Me showing pride in myself is no shade on you or anybody else. I think that because my parents surrounded us with Black excellence and pride in our heritage, that helped to inoculate me from the racism, the anti-Black racism that swirled around outside. So when those kids got out of the pool, the hilarious thing is they thought that they were saving themselves. I was like, what is wrong with y'all? Something is wrong with that because you're distancing yourself from me and I'm fabulous. That was the honest, and of course it hurts because I'm sort of saying, what is going on? But my parents were always there, and that's how they raised us, and that's how they were raised, and that's how we raise our children as well.
So when you're sitting then in that grad school meeting at Darden with the women, and you're like, okay, something's not right here. You speak up. There's no question of confidence. You speak up, you tell them what you think, and then they tell you you're making it more difficult. Let's solve this problem first, then we'll get to that problem. They literally marginalize your thoughts and your ideas.
Yeah, I don't think that they would say, and I wish, because I'm like, I can see some of the faces of the women who were there, and I should probably call them and follow up and find out their recollection of what happened. But what I remember happening was sort of, you're trying to prioritize the approach and organize how we're going to do this strategically. And the emphasis was on talk about us as women. This is graduate women in business. It's not Black graduate women in business. And so I felt as though, well, if we talked about Black women, we could actually address women in general. Because if you fix some of the issues that are preventing Black women from joining the faculty, that's not only going to address all women, but it will actually even enhance the experience for male faculty or for people who identify with any number of genders. All the genders can be benefited by looking at the experience of Black women. And Dr. Frances Frye from Harvard, she talks about that. I mean, I describe Black women as the canary in the coal mine. And we see this with COVID and with all kinds of health issues, employment issues, educational issues. Whenever you try to address those issues, when you think about the challenges that Black women are confronting, when you address those, it tends to benefit everyone. And in that way, we're often the canary in the coal mine.
Yes. So why? So why is it that and you talk about this in the book, why is it that when given the choice between race and gender, people will choose gender first all the time?
White women. Well, I should ask you that, Laura. Why do y'all choose gender first?
I mean, maybe because it feels more universal. Maybe because I haven't walked in your shoes, so I don't know what it's like to be a Black woman, and so I assume your experience as a woman is the same as my experience as a woman, and I feel plenty of marginalization. So I just assume, well, yeah, I get it. Like, you're marginalized, I'm marginalized, we're sisters. Yeah. When clearly I have no concept of what it must be like to be and for all those other reasons. I mean, yeah. I sat on the other side of a executive search table for 20 years, interviewing all walks of life. And I will tell you that and in that search work, I talked to people about why I got into very difficult mission-driven work. And every single type of person cried telling me stories in that interview chair, except for Black women. In 20 years, interviewing thousands of people, never did a Black woman break emotion.
Yeah, and so what's interesting, Laura, I would say when I flip the question back on you about why do white women pick gender, I think it's important for people to recognize that whiteness is rendered invisible. And what I mean by that is the cultural norms, access, resources that are associated with whiteness are not really readily discussed. People don't talk about that, as opposed to Blackness is discussed. It is often reviled, it's often stigmatized. So at an early age, you have to decide, how are you going to interact with this? What are you going to imbibe? What are you going to internalize? And that's why I think that white women choose gender over race or ethnicity. The other thing is that, the way that, and I really want people to understand, whiteness is different than being white. Whiteness is the system that's behind it, if that makes sense. But, if I say, where are you from? Ireland, Italy, that's very different. But the reason why all of those people and cultures are lumped into being white, there's a very strategic political reason behind that. And if you look at the history of the construct of race, you see what went into that. And that helps to explain why white people can sort of ignore that, but Black people, Hispanic, Latinx people, Asian, Middle Eastern people, Indigenous people are loath to often ignore that.
Yeah, yeah. I when Barack Obama was elected president, everyone's like, "Great, we live in a post-race society," and I was like,
Mm-mm.
"No, we
Mm-mm.
don't. Like, we're talking about race all day long. That's not a, like
Yeah,
that's we that's we shouldn't live in a post-race society. That's a terrible goal. I think
yeah,
we should live in a race-centric society where we talk
yeah,
about it and it's part of the conversation. But it felt so weird to me as somebody who grew up in that super diverse high school
yeah,
to be like, what do you we everybody was in everybody's business in Miami. It was like a giant soup and we were all there and like we talked about it openly all the time, and it's almost like having to pull all the way back where we can't say these words and we can't mention these things, and
yeah.
I wonder, I'm sort of interested in your take on like the sort of the woke army, quote unquote, and where they play in terms of having this conversation. Is it allowing the conversation to happen more, or is it silencing some of the conversation because we can't talk about some of these things?
What do you mean by woke army? Because I will tell you, that's a pejorative for some people. For other people, it's a compliment. How are you
Yeah.
defining it?
So I am saying quote unquote woke army because there are people out there that are like, well, I can't say any words because the woke army will come at me. That's the way that I'm using the term.
In the
I
pejorative sense. Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes.
And so, we've talked about this personally. I feel this is not a both sides argument.
Yeah.
Because what's happening in the world is not equal. I'm sorry,
Yes.
it's not equivalent. A thread that I see that is very concerning is this notion that you cannot demonstrate ignorance, you can't make mistakes, you can't. If someone calls me African American and I want to be called Black, or someone calls me Black and I want to be called African American, how I have seen some people shut down and
Yes.
yelled at and corrected, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Should we all learn to be more self-aware and other aware? Those are critical components of emotional intelligence. Absolutely. But in Shared Sisterhood, I talk a lot about extending grace to people. And that is one thing that I'm really big on, which is where if we're having a conversation and we're trying to connect authentically, and when I say authentic connection, that means we can be vulnerable with each other, we can trust each other, we can empathize, and we can take risks. So we really, we're bringing the private conversation into our relationship so that I might say, well, Laura, I know there was a lot of diversity, meaning numeric representation in Miami, but was it equitable? We can have that conversation and we can peel back some of the layers. I don't see that happening a lot in
Yeah.
public discourse.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that we try to do in Shared Sisterhood every Friday at 3 o'clock Eastern.
If you have not gone to Clubhouse, and if you have not downloaded the app, do it, and make sure on Fridays you are at the Shared Sisterhood conversation. It is every Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern, and it's fantastic. I often will go in, and you will kindly invite me to the stage, and I'll usually text you on the side and be like, I'm just here to listen. I'm just here to
Yeah.
learn. Like that
Yeah.
my voice does not need to be elevated on this subject until I have more intelligence on
Yes.
this subject. But
Yes.
so, on the way back, so you and I just spoke at TEDx Reno. Our videos are going to be coming out soon.
Awesome
I
job.
sat in the audience and loved your talk, and it was great, and I can't wait for everybody to see it. One of our fellow speakers is an evangelical Christian, and he and I flew home. He was flying back to Oklahoma, and I was flying to New York, but we both flew through Dallas from Reno. So we had 3.5 hours on the plane to just sit and chat. And I was like, I got to ask you some questions. And I was asking him question after question after question about his like deep religious, super
Yeah.
pro-life, super anti-gay, super like everything on the opposite of what I believe in the world.
Right.
And there was no judgment. There was no
Yeah.
defensiveness. He was fully confident in his views. And I was able to just ask questions. And at one point in the conversation, I was like, man, I feel like I need a passport for this conversation because I literally feel like I'm in another country. Like it's just
Yeah.
I feel like I'm speaking in a different language. But it was such, and I'm not raising that to talk about religion with you. I'm raising it to say, like, I felt like it was such a gift to
Yeah.
me to just be able to sit and explore, like, well, why do you think this, and where does that come from, and what if one of your children was gay, or what if
Yeah.
what if you had what if your wife got pregnant accidentally, or what about rape and I was able to ask all these questions that I was so curious about in this super non-judgmental way, in a like, go do your own homework. I can't find that on the internet with somebody who I can actually have a conversation
Right,
with.
right.
And at the end, we got off the plane in Dallas. I turned to him and I was just like, you know what? Thank you. Like,
Yeah.
thank you for letting me just run around your brain and ask questions in this non-judgmental
Right.
but super curious way. And so we don't get to have those conversations enough with people,
Yeah.
because I think everyone is so afraid of being called racist, or being called ignorant, or being called lazy, or, like, just making the wrong move and getting, quote unquote, canceled.
I think you're right. I mean, so I have been blessed to have conversations like that as well. And I identify as a Christian.
Yes.
Now, what's interesting is hopefully, when you've talked to me, you've talked to him, talk to other people of different religions, and there'll be some similarities and some dissimilarities. And as a Black Christian, I say Black well, I identify as Christian Black woman. There are some things that I don't want to talk about necessarily my personal religion, or maybe we will end up getting into that, but I don't identify necessarily with evangelical Christians, though I do believe in the Bible, right? So it's sort of, I have a more social.
But again, you're choosing like Black Christian, like, it's like there's a prioritization of identities.
Well, and I do choose Christian before Black, if I'm honest. I mean, I do choose Christian because I believe in Christ, and I believe that whatever. When we talk about the construct of race, I think it can be, the way that I practice my Christian faith is informed by the fact that I'm Black. If that makes sense. And my perception of what it is to be Black is informed by the fact that I'm a Christian, that I'm a believer, that I am so in Jesus Christ. So I think it's important. That's a whole different conversation.
We could do a whole other show about that. So let's go back to the shared sisterhood framework. Mm-hmm. So you are beginning to understand that it can't just be Black women standing up. It can't just be white women standing up. We have to do this thing together. And at a certain point, you write this draft of a manuscript, but then you shelve for a while until the summer of 2020, and all of a sudden the world wakes up and realizes maybe they should be paying more attention to this thing that has been going on forever that we have conveniently ignored. Your phone's ringing off the hook and you're like, I wrote this manuscript, but you decide that you can't put this book out yourself, that you need a white ally to do it with.
Yes.
I want to hear a little bit more about why you felt that way.
Yeah. So, and I mean, calling it a manuscript is generous. It was probably a rough draft.
It was a manifesto, maybe.
Exactly. It was this, it was this idea on paper that I would keep pulling out, because Shared Sisterhood, I've been working on this for over a decade, thinking about it, but it just never got traction. I didn't feel like it was right. And then when George Floyd was murdered, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, I think many of us were in pain, actually bleeding. And I just felt that Shared Sisterhood needed something. And then I realized, okay, if I'm going to talk about shared sisterhood, not sisterhood. Sisterhood I look at as between me and my Black girlfriends, right? Shared sisterhood is a cross difference, specifically racial ethnic, but it could be religious or country of origin, etc. I need to write this with somebody of a different racial ethnicity. And I immediately thought of Dr. Beth Livingston, because she's a co-conspirator. And I do want for your audience to distinguish, we distinguish between ally, accomplice, and co-conspirator.
Okay.
We live in New England, both you and I do. And I would say that New Englanders consider themselves primarily allies, right? They say, I believe in equity and justice, as long as I don't have to sacrifice anything. Many times it's sort of, I don't want that school in my neighborhood. I don't want my kids to have to be bused. Let's not even talk about Boston and the busing situation.
Right.
But if you go back to the 70s, those white people would have probably considered themselves progressives. But when it came down to sacrificing something, they were out. It became clear that it was an us versus them. So that's sort of allies. They believe in justice in theory. Accomplices are people who believe in justice and they're willing to actually sacrifice something, but it's on their own terms. So that might be somebody who says, I want to help you all, women, get more pay. I think you all should demand a meeting with the president. Well, what do the women want? Maybe they don't want that. It doesn't matter. This accomplice will sort of push that agenda because in their mind, that's what needs to happen. The final level is co-conspirator, and that's someone who is willing to who believes in equity, but is willing to sacrifice based on how they are directed or the influence of the historically marginalized group that they're speaking up for. So that looks something like the same gender wage gap. Okay, I want to work with you all. How can I use my power to benefit you? Let's brainstorm. And the women or the people who don't identify as men often will be the ones who are brainstorming and saying, well, this is what we'd like. We'd like to see salary by race, by division, by gender for the last 10 years. You know the president. Can you go? So, and then that co-conspirator will go and meet with the president and say, this is what I want. So knowing that is really what the whole group wants. But by using their privilege, they're protecting the other people from the backlash of asking for that information. So Beth is a co-conspirator. Beth will, there have been so many instances in public forums, and I can stand up for myself, right? But as a Black woman who does this work, I'm often pilloried, and that can be hard. So, and this is going back to your conversation on the airplane. So I love those conversations. One of the challenges is that I'm having those conversations every day, multiple times a day. How many times are you engaging in that conversation? Probably once in a while. And so it feels, it's like this, you need a passport. It's awesome. It's engaging. It's energizing. If you were having that conversation 3 times a day for a month, you might get a little fatigued.
Sure.
So then what ends up happening is I say, okay, I need some co-conspirators to jump in the conversation so that I'm not always the one who's the tip of the arrow. And Beth was willing. She's like, I got your back, but better yet, I got your front. Let me handle the audience, the pushback, the editor, the person who's not as helpful as they could be. I will navigate this. Tell me how you want me to do this. Let's figure this out together. That is what Beth is. And that's why the book was able to, I was able to finish the book. And I don't know if you want to talk, we're actually going to talk about this on Friday, I think, which is the whole book process. But we can talk about how the contracts came about. Whatever you want to talk about, Laura, I'm open to.
Well, I want to talk more about the ideas behind the book because I think that you are incredible, and I don't want to waste the time I have with you talking about the process of writing a book when I can talk about the process of dismantling racism by working together. If people want to learn more about how you wrote this book, they can go to Shared Sisterhood on Clubhouse on Fridays, and they can hear about it. But I want to talk about the meat of the book. So your Shared Sisterhood process includes some steps. So let's walk through. If you have decided, all right, I thought I was an ally and that's a good thing, and I realized that I'm actually not doing enough, and maybe I do want to become a co-conspirator. I want to just skip right past the middle step here. I want to be all in. And I gave a TEDx talk where I was like, stop asking how can I help? Like, ask what needs to happen. Like, stop putting yourself in the center of the issue. Like, it made me crazy. And we're not solving problems this way. And it's because a lot of people like me are like, oh, how can I help? I'll go march in the streets. It's like, well, no, maybe what you should do is you should fund organizations that are creating, bail funds, or that are, fixing tires, or like whatever, to like help people who should have their voices elevated. And it's like crazy making to me. So I love this idea that you can be a co-conspirator, and it does involve some sacrifice, but it's not the same as what we're hearing, which is like, oh, well, people aren't going to be satisfied until I give up all of my privilege and give up my seat. And it's that's not what people are asking. They're asking you to use your seat to help other people get in the room too. So,
and by the way, when you help other people get in the room, your seat may be enlarged.
Exactly.
The former argument, they want me to give up my seat and my privilege, that's based on a zero-sum mentality.
Yes.
Which honestly, and competitive, which is very traditionally masculine.
Yes.
Aggressive.
In power.
Exactly. That's the traditional image of power. Shared sisterhood, we selected the word sister because we're trying to come at leadership and power from a nurturing, empathetic, trusting perspective. And
Yes.
anyone can be a sister regardless of gender. So if you don't identify as a woman, you're still on the hook, as I talk about. And I think that is so important. It is really important to lay down that notion of, and I have a metaphor. I won't get into about the monkey trap. The hunt. Well, I'm going to have to tell you now. So
I was like, wait, what?
in some countries, they trap monkeys.
Okay.
Right? And the way that they do this is they'll take something. They'll go to a tree, and they will carve out a hole. And they'll put something that the monkey desires, like something sweet, on the inside. And the hole is big enough for the monkey to get its hand through, and then it grasps the sweet stuff, and its hand is in a fist. The hole is too small for the monkey to get its hand out when it's in a fist. The monkey will not release that thing, and it gets caught. And that's the same thing. You have got to be willing to release this notion of a zero-sum game, of hyper competition, or else you're going to get caught by yourself, sort of in this rumination where you think that you're losing, when in fact you could be gaining, when in fact you could be benefiting. And so anyway, I'll pause there. I don't want to start preaching. I feel like I'm preaching, Laura.
No, this is great. This is great. No, and I think that we see that so often, I mean, like even in our American political system, the desire to hold on to power stops so much progress. And I've never thought about that in terms of, if the monkey just released the banana, they'd be free.
Yes.
Just you can't get to that place. So okay, so how do we start?
So it's shared sisterhood is built on three critical things. So the practices of dig is the first part. And dig is about understanding your own assumptions about things like racial ethnicity and gender. So one of the questions I like to ask I ask white people when did you become white? And they go, well, I'm guessing from the question you don't mean when I was born. And I was like, ding, 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 ding. Correct. When did you realize that whiteness was a system? That it was different to be white than it was to be Black? When did you first realize that? And many times for white people, it's when they're younger, but they don't necessarily explore it. It's when they're in college that they may begin to really recognize it and begin to, like Beth talks about, she took classes and she began to really sort of disentangle what it meant to be white. She had never dealt with that before. In contrast, I talk about the story of when I get into the pool and all the white kids get out, and how before then, Black encyclopedias, dictionaries, picture books, I've known about that the whole time. So the reason I shared that is because the dig process looks different if you're from a historically marginalized people group versus a power dominant group. And I want to explain that. I don't use the terms minority and majority. First, would you want to be called a minority? It just feels less than, it's supposed to be numerical minority, but actually I think it's by 2025 or something like that.
Yeah, it's not even accurate.
It's not even accurate. It's always globally, it's always been inaccurate because brown people have always been the majority. White people have never been the majority in the United States, perhaps, but not around the globe. And check me on that. So I use the term power dominant to refer to power, and power is access to and influence over resources.
Sure.
And historically marginalized are people who have been excluded or marginalized from access to that power. Power is at the crux of the whole construct of race. Going back to our earlier conversation, if you look at why race was even constructed, it had to do with power and capitalism and imperialism. I won't get into that. That's a different conversation. But if you don't believe me, go do the research, like Laura said. Don't just sit there and wait for me to tell you. Go educate yourself and refute what I'm saying. Correct me. I could be wrong, right? Hint, I'm not. And this is this is not because I'm so amazing. This is because there's history and data.
Because you've done the research.
Yeah, I've done the research. Well, and not even me. My husband's a history professor. There are far more brilliant people who've dedicated their lives to understanding these things. That's another thing I want to say about shared sisterhood. When we dig, which is about servicing your assumptions, we also recognize that facts are not equal to opinion. I have so many people who come up to me and they say, well, Tina, my opinion is if you're even talking about race, you're being divisive. We should all just work hard and let's, honey, please. Now, do I wish we could go to a point where I don't want you to be colorblind. That's a racist ideology because what ends up happening is you render my blackness invisible and then the norm becomes whiteness. So I'm measured against that. We see the tulips. You go to, what is it, Netherlands or something, and you see the red, the green. We don't devalue the yellow flower compared to the red. That's where we need to get where both of them are considered beautiful and how they contribute. That's what I want to get to. That's where I would like the world to get to. It's not colorblind. Why do we want a bunch of gray flowers?
I had a conversation with a boomer over the weekend who was deeply offended that at a graduation, one of the students got up and said, well, as a Black Muslim first generation student, I feel blah, 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 and talked about how important it was for representation, that she was chosen as the class speaker, that she was on stage. And this boomer said that they were offended that she was leading with that, making it a label, putting the race in our face, making it a thing. And I was like, if I ran a marathon and I started that marathon 10 miles before everybody else, and then at the end, somebody interviewed me about how I thought the marathon went, you best believe I would say, well, since I ran 36 miles, like, you better believe that I would start with that. And in fact, it is like, number one, I don't get a vote about whether or not she gets to start with that and how
Yeah.
she wants to identify herself. And number two, she is proud of this and she should be. And number three, we should be embarrassed that she has to get up there and say this because it means that this has been so much harder for her than everyone else. And the person I was talking to was like, well, I don't agree with that. And I just think labels and I was just like, my head was going to explode. But
Well, what's so funny is again, look at where the label came from. It
yes,
didn't come from me. It came from white people who
yes,
had access to resource and power and decided to label this whole bastion of people as other.
yes, yes.
So now you don't want the label.
Right.
And I think the issue is that there is more of a conversation about what the meaning behind those labels. I think it makes white people feel very uncomfortable
Yes.
because what happens is, Laura, you used the example of the marathon and you're running 36 point something miles versus somebody else ran 26 miles and you win. Oh my gosh. But if the other person always wants to think that things are equal, all of a sudden you bringing up the fact that you ran 36 miles means you outperformed them.
Yes. Well, it feels very threatening.
But
if all you've ever had is privilege, then equality or equity rather feels very threatening. Yeah. This like reverse racism, like that doesn't exist. That's not a thing. Yeah.
And for those who are listening who may be offended by this conversation, sometimes it can help to switch from race to gender. Because I've had people say, I'm like, when you want color blindness, would you want no gender either? Oh, no. This is often, no. I think it's good to identify men and women. Well, why?
Right.
Why can we do that, but we can't, or men, women, and people, who don't identify as who may be non-binary or fluid. Why is that okay?
Yeah.
But and actually, in many instances, the people who are opposed to talking about race are also opposed to talking about non-binary or fluid. But that's again another conversation.
Yes.
I think it flies in the face of meritocracy. People like to think, especially people who are at the top, like to believe that they got there. There's something called the meritocracy myth. There's something called the Protestant work ethic. These are academic theories that you can look into. It really is threatening to the self when you think that you got to a place, not by virtue of your performance only, but by virtue of who you know, where you went to school, how much money you had, the kind of tutoring you had.
Or even just how hard you worked as opposed to everyone else. My husband always likes to say, like, unless you're an indigenous person, you were born, like your people were here when the pilgrims got here. Like, everyone thinks they were on the last good boat.
Yeah.
Like, we all think that we were the last good ones in, right? But no, right? I mean, in terms of white people, and it's deeply frustrating because people have worked hard. They think they've worked hard. They just don't realize. Sometimes you don't realize that you're starting on third base.
Yeah, and I will say, I don't think I was on the last good boat. It was not a good boat.
No, that's why I'm saying for white
I know.
people. That's why I said for white
I
people,
white
right?
people.
For
I know.
white
I
people, right?
got you. I got you. But it is funny because when people say we're all immigrants, mm-mm,
Yeah,
no, we're not. Now, none of us started here, yes, but I would
right.
like that language to be a little bit more specific because every time that I hear that argument, I'm like, that doesn't feel like it includes me
Mm-hmm.
because it was not
Okay,
voluntary. Let's not talk about Ellis Island when it doesn't apply to everyone's experience. So anyway,
right. So right. That's why I added like for white people in that, because
yes,
clearly not everybody, not everybody was happy on their boat, or chose to be on that boat, or ever would have wanted any of that experience. So okay, so we dig, and I was thinking about your question of like when did I realize I was white? And it's interesting because I sort of always knew I was white because I was in such a diverse school, and
Mhm.
always growing up in Miami was such a diverse place. But when did I realize that that brought me privilege and power? For sure. Like the first time I got in trouble in high school and my friend who was black got punished and I didn't, right? And I was like, well,
Yeah,
that's interesting, right? Or why am I getting called on in school more often than that person? Right? Like I'm
yeah,
getting better grades, but that's because I'm getting, a lot of credit for being participatory in class. Well,
yeah.
if I don't get, you don't get called on, you don't get the credit, you don't, right? Like so there's all of this, and I had teachers of every race, of every of every nationality. I mean, it was so diverse, and still there was this expectation that whiteness was somehow there was
Superior.
some connotation that there was a superiority in there.
Yeah. And I remember when we were talking about this when you and I were in Florida, I wonder what your Black and Latinx friends would say about their experience there. Because I remember I have a story in the 7th grade. I had a math teacher, Mr. S. He was a lot of people's favorite math teacher. Well, he told me that he didn't think that I belonged
Yeah,
in the classroom. And this is a story that I think I share in the book as
you do.
well. And my mother ended up having to come to the school and she put him in check and I ended up doing fine. But I remember I was in a shared sisterhood in the Facebook group for shared sisterhood. One of my classmates, and I don't think she'd mind me saying her name is Erica. She said, I was telling the story and she said, oh my God, I sat right next to you. He was my favorite teacher. She started crying because she's like, I had no idea that you were dealing with those issues. And I was like, well, it happened in the classroom. So
Yeah.
it's sort of when you're having a positive experience, it can blind you to the fact that people around you are having negative experiences.
It's interesting because I actually had one of my black high school classmates on the show, a couple seasons ago. She is an award-winning children's book author, and she got into writing children's books because she was like, I was reading books to my kids, and I was like, there are no black characters in here. And when there were
Exactly.
black characters, they did not represent my black experience because all the writers are white. And so we had a whole conversation about the publishing world and representation and why it matters for especially
Yeah.
children's literature. And we ended up talking about high school on the show, and I mentioned something about how, like, I didn't have a college counselor. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what I was doing. She's like, wait, I just assumed that you did because you were one of the rich white kids. I just assumed that you had it all figured out. And I was like, no, I didn't. And I actually had experiences where I had teachers tell me that I didn't belong in certain classrooms and all of that. So I think my experience was unusual in that
Yeah.
it was sort of an equal opportunity shit show in my high school growing up. And yet I am sure that even though I still did not have a great experience, it was so much better than so many other people. So I can't even imagine like the ignorance
Well,
that must exist when you don't even have
and,
that.
and I appreciate you with adding that sort of nuance and that caveat because one of the challenges can be, I think, in a desire to bridge is the second. So dig is the first practice, bridge is the second, and bridge is about connecting with people who are different.
Right.
And I think many people want to connect. I mean, a fundamental human need is the need for belongingness,
Yes.
the need to feel like you belong to a relationship, a group. And so I won't get into all the theories, self-determination theory, but when I think many white people want to connect with people who are not white.
Yes.
They want to connect with Black people. In the attempt to do that, they sort of flatten the differences and focus on the similarities. We're both women, we're both academics, but within that, there are so many different experiences. And so I think it's really important for white people men, women, they, whoever, whatever your gender, to really pause. And as you said, add the nuance. If it was difficult for me, I cannot imagine what must have happened
Yes.
for Black people. That is an opening, as opposed to what's sometimes been said to me. Well, I experienced that too, Tina. It's just probably because of gender. It's not, I don't think it's racism. That is infuriating.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that is probably someone who needs to dig why is it when a Black person talks to you about racism, you need to negate that. You need to make it something that you can relate to. In a way, you are centering yourself as opposed to centering the other person.
Yes.
And that's something that Shared Sisterhood does, is it centers historically marginalized people. And I've shared that I'm a Christian. So if I'm in a conversation with someone who's an atheist or Muslim or Hindu, I tend to listen, unless they're asking me questions openly, I tend to listen a lot more than I talk. Why? Because in this country, being a Christian is normative. Well,
yes.
Some people would argue that, but I think the way that it's embedded in the power structure, Christianity is what has had more access to power.
Yes.
Or I shouldn't say Christianity. Christianity means Christ-like. Perpetrating like you're Christian.
Right.
Even though you may have never cracked the Bible, may never fellowship with people, none of that stuff.
Yes.
I don't want to talk about somebody who held up a
Bible upside down, right?
Yeah. And talking about 2 Corinthians, we won't get into that. But, and I may have just offended people, but I'm sorry, you got to call it what like it is. That is connected to the power structure.
Yes.
And as a result, I mean, there's a reason why people play at being Christian. Why they say that, because it gives them access to resource and influence over resources.
Yes.
It's about power. So I think it's really important to not forget that when you're bridging, I have more power.
So
From
this
a
is
collective standpoint, not necessarily from an individual standpoint. And that's another issue that I think white people need to hear. There are levels of analysis. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, well, I'm sort of thinking about this because I've often struggled with this question of like, I want to bridge with you. So I want to say, I get it. I've had anti-Semitism. I understand what you're going through. And my Black friends are like, yeah, except your Holocaust is over and ours is still going on, right? They're like, sit down, like, shut up. Like, that is not like, so it's hard because I'm trying to find this connection so that we can, I think what I was trying to do was bridge so that we could dig. When instead there's digging so that you can bridge. And what I'm realizing in this conversation that I don't think I've ever realized in quite this way is that every piece of my identity, I'm white, I'm a woman, I'm Jewish, I'm a mother, I'm a sister, I'm an athlete, I'm a friend, all these things. In each of those, I prioritize different parts of myself differently. And so I can bridge with you as a woman, but I need to dig with you as a white woman. Right. I think there's, or you need to dig with me as a Christian where I'm a Jew. Right. Like so each of us have different. Yeah.
Yeah. And what I would say is as a white woman, you may need to do some dig about your whiteness before you try to bridge with a Black woman.
Right.
And then when we're bridging so it is an iterative process.
Yes.
So what we like to say is, you know, when the person who was at the graduation with you, if that person was familiar with Shared Sisterhood, you could have said, okay, well, tell me, you said that you're offended by that. What emotion are you feeling? And what was it about her or him identifying that they're a Muslim first generation person? Was it that they're first generation? Probably not, because that is different. Being a Muslim, what about that? What did that trigger? What thoughts did you have? And then if that person could go away and really reflect on that, and journal as we suggest and really reflect, then they might be ready to come back to you and have a conversation. The other thing that I want that example exemplifies is I'm really happy, and this is a lesson. This was another white person who was talking to you as a Jewish, but I'm assuming you all are both white.
We're both white and both Jewish.
Yeah, both white and both Jewish. So there's some sense of similarity and affinity. I'm so happy that was it a he or a she? That she didn't go to the speaker and try to bridge, because she could have done but think about that happens all the time.
Yes.
Before she did the dig work, if she had gone to the Muslim person, listen, we're both alums or we're both women. I don't see why you had to emphasize that you were Muslim and first generation. That is not going to go well. that is going to cause a problem. So in Shared Sisterhood, we talk about how it's often important to dig with some ratio-ethnically similar others so that you can do the work and not cause harm with other people. We often say it's important to bridge with people who are dissimilar in terms of racial ethnicity. So, but it's this iterative process where you try to bridge, something works well or doesn't, you go back to your group of other white women perhaps, or other Black women, and you say, this, I want to dig on this particular issue. And again, we're not saying that all white women are the same or all Black women are the same. Some people will critique, fine, go, if that makes you feel better, go ahead, but that's not what we're saying. But it's important to recognize the iterative nature. So you dig, you bridge, and then the third is collective action. And this is where Shared Sisterhood is different than most of the diversity, equity, and inclusion approaches, frameworks, strategies, because it is the whole purpose of dig. You'll know more about yourself, but that's not the end result. The whole purpose of bridge is to have authentic connection with people who are different from you, but that's not the destination. Right. Collective action is the point. The point is, once you've done the dig and you can actually connect with people, now we can link arms and start to dismantle systemic inequity. You know, I talk about amplification, I talk about, which is where, I mean, I can go into that example if you want, Laura, let me know, but really actually attacking the collective level, the system. So how you recruit, how you onboard, how you socialize, how you people into your organization, how you pay them, how you promote them, what's determined, what is considered to be professional, what's considered to be a good fit, who gets in more trouble than others. And by trouble, I mean, you know, put on performance improvement plans. Do they still have PIPs at organizations? and it's always interesting to see, there is a disproportionate number of people from historically marginalized categories who end up on these performance improvement plans. Is that a self-fulfilling prophecy? Was it that's how, you know, what happened and how they were perceived from the beginning? Are they actually, they could be underperforming, but why? And I think it's important to disentangle that, because if you think that women are underperforming because they're just not capable, is that sexism? I mean, are you saying that you really believe that women are genetically inferior when it comes to performance? If you think that Black people are underperforming because they're genetically, that is racism. That's the definition of racism. So either you believe that there's something wrong with this individual, or that they don't have the effort, they're too lazy. Okay, again, those are racist stereotypes. Or there's something systemic or happening at the collective level. And why are we so afraid to try that? So you can test multiple hypotheses. And I think looking at the collective is important.
Okay, so we have like 2 minutes left. If I am if I've listened to this podcast and I'm like, oh, I got some work to do, but I'm the CEO of my company and I want to start doing something tomorrow, and digging sounds like a lot of work and bridging sounds like a lot of work and collective action is where I want to get to. Are there things, obviously I want to go through all of the process, but if I'm the CEO of a company, or if I'm running a division or a department, are there questions that I can ask myself, like the one you said, like who is put on performance of improvement plans? Like what are there things that I could look at quickly, numbers I could look at quickly in my department or in my division or my company to say like, oh, we've got work to do. Let me get started so I can show it across to other people to help them. Because everyone's like, oh, they're a racist. I'm not a racist, but they're a racist, right? Yeah, what are the questions that somebody who is in charge, in power, can ask themselves right now to help get this started and convince other people they need to be part of the process?
Okay, good. So they're qualitative and quantitative things. So qualitatively, you can look at, you probably already have data. What's the engagement level? What's the well-being of people based on race and gender and the interaction of the two? And you may want sexual orientation as well. That's the first thing. How are they engaging? What's their well-being like? What's their identification with your organization? That's the qualitative part. Quantitatively, immediately, you can pull race by gender, by division, right now, by level. And you can see, how are we paying people? What are the promotion rates? You can just literally look at the numbers in that way. If you don't see any things that are different, I'm going to encourage you to dig, because you are probably unlike the majority of organizations that are out there. And we know this from McKinsey and Lean In. We know this from Catalyst. We know this from Pew. There are any number of reputable data sources that suggest that there are inequities in the workplace. So qualitatively and quantitatively, that's something you can do today. You can start today.
Tina, this has been an amazing conversation. Tell us a little bit more about Shared Sisterhood, the book, about the Clubhouse Room, and about where people can find you for keynotes and workshops.
Thank you so much, Laura. So you can find me at drtinaopie.com. And Shared Sisterhood is coming out in October of this year. Yes.
Woo!
Yes, you can go to my website, again, drtinaopie.com, and you can find all the information about the book. You can also book me as a speaker, because this is the kind of conversation we tend to have, and I provide the strategies and tactics to get it done.
So I just want to encourage anybody who is listening that a great way that you can be a co-conspirator is that you can go and order Tina's book right now. Okay. Ordering her book will tell the bookstores that they should be stocking it, that they should be putting it front facing, that they should be putting in the window so that everyone can see it and buy it. So a great way to help amplify this very important thinker, writer, academic, researcher, and just phenomenal all-around champion is to go and pre-order her book right now. Tina, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you, Laura.